Hi, everybody. We'll just give it a minute and then we'll kick off. Just give it a few more seconds, then we'll get started. All right, let's get going. So thanks everyone for joining this webinar. This is the second webinar in a series of 8 about Housing First and the principles and how we put them into practice. For those that joined the first webinar a fortnight ago, Charlotte and Rosie covered the principles that everybody has a right to a home and that housing and support are separated. And today, Leah and I are going to delve into more of the kind of practical stuff to do with that. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands that we're meeting on today. I'm on Gadigal land and Leah's on Whadjuk Noongar land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal people who might be here today. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So Leah and I will be presenting today. Leah works for Housing Choices WA and has been in the sector for 30 years and is also a very experienced Housing First trainer. I work at Newtown Neighbourhood Centre in Sydney for a Housing First program called Together Home, contracted by housing providers and funded through the state government. So during this webinar, we really want to encourage you to leave any questions you might have using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer anything we can at the end of the webinar. And because it's a webinar, you're automatically on mute. Your camera's automatically off. So if you need to make any noise or anything, don't worry, no one can see you or hear you. So we're going to follow on from last fortnight's session to see how we can put these principles into practice, the principles of everybody has a right to home and that housing and support are separated. These are very much about housing, these two principles, how it's delivered and how it's managed in Housing First programs. Future sessions are going to look more into providing support and the practice implications associated with those, and I really recommend tuning in. So let's refresh our memory of last week's webinar. The first principle covered was that everybody has a right to a home. This means that every person has a right to not just accommodation, but to a home that they had a hand in choosing that meets their needs. This also means that housing shouldn't rely on eligibility criteria like sobriety or stable mental health or even previous experience sustaining a tenancy. Housing should also remain available to people over periods of absence. So if they're visiting their family, if they have sorry business, if they're hospitalised, if they're incarcerated, things like that. We see this done really well with some community housing providers offering extremely subsidised rent for periods of absence or where a tenant might not be receiving income. The second principle is that support provided to people in Housing First programs should be separate from the housing provided to them. This means that people don't need to engage with support to retain their tenancy and that people don't need to retain their tenancy to engage with support. It also means that while housing providers and support providers may work closely together, and they really should work closely together, the support provider acts as an advocate where necessary to ensure that their participants' housing needs are met, rather than working on behalf of the housing provider. Both of these principles work really well together to deliver housing in a way that keeps the person being housed at the forefront of program design and decision making. So now I'm going to hand over to Leah to talk about the elephant in the room.
As Alice said, before we start unpacking how to put these principles into practice, we do really need to talk about the elephant in the room. How do we do housing first, and in particular work to principles that highlight the need to house someone really quickly when we're in a housing crisis? In the words of Finnish Housing First rock stars Y Foundation, you can't do housing first without doing the housing first. The fidelity debate that Rosie and Charlotte unpacked in the last webinar speaks to this. We may not be in a position to deliver a high fidelity housing first model, but while we're waiting for housing and other resources to come on stream, we can use the housing first principles in the way that we deliver all of our support services and to train staff in using these principles to build trauma-informed services. I highly recommend attending other webinars in the series, which might help you explore how to incorporate those principles into your day-to-day practice. Things like harm reduction, choice and self-determination, active engagement. Also, while we're waiting for more housing stock, we can at least provide housing first to the small number of people who need it most by housing them as quickly as possible and putting quality wraparound services for them that are based on the principles. But for today, the question remains, where are the houses coming from? Social housing is often the first place we look to find housing for people experiencing chronic homelessness. However, our social housing waitlists are growing in every state. For example, a recent study in Queensland showed a 78% increase in their waitlists since 2018. This means that we're often working with the opposite of housing first timeframes, as services are competing to find housing within a very tight and fundamentally broken system. While we do acknowledge that both state and federal governments are working on this, things like Victoria's Big Housing Build or the federal government commitment to the Housing Future Fund, we're also really conscious of the timeframes to build new housing stock and the numbers of new houses that we would need to address the high level of needs. So in this context, how can we make sure that the housing stock we do have is available for people experiencing long-term homelessness through Housing First programs? Connecting Housing First methodology to collective impact projects can help improve, prioritise people sleeping rough and use best fit allocation approach that is more aligned with Housing First. Examples of this include the former 50 Lives, 50 Homes and 500 Lives, 500 Homes projects that Queensland and WA had, which have grown into the Advance to Zero collaborations across many capital cities and regional communities. These collaborative projects bring together support and housing providers so they can work to deliver housing to people without readiness criteria, also keeping an eye on people returning to homelessness and advocating for rapid rehousing. Again, this is in line with the Housing First principles. Effectively, collective impact projects can help us stitch together a Housing First service system out of existing services by breaking down silos and creating mechanisms for us to work together. I used to work for one of these projects in WA, where we would sit around the table with housing providers, and they had a commitment to allocating properties to people with complex needs who had experienced chronic homelessness and try to find the right house for the right person rather than just taking someone off the top of the list. So we did things like find a unit with a small courtyard that was next to a dog park for a woman who had been sleeping rough for years and had a large dog that was a critical part of her safety and support system. We liaised with community housing providers to work outside their normal allocation process so we could find a home for an Aboriginal man who refused to complete any housing applications or have any further contact with our housing department because of his past traumatic experiences with them. We also got a commitment from housing providers to rehouse an older woman immediately after she was released from prison so that the work and confidence she had built in having her first home in many years before she went into prison was not lost. Managed to achieve these outcomes and align our practice with Housing First principles, even though we didn't have Housing First funding or additional housing, by bringing both support and housing providers together under the banner of a collective impact project. I'm going to hand back to Alice now. Who's going to explore if we've got any chance of getting housing out of the private rental market.
So as it stands, private rentals without any kind of subsidy aren't really an option for someone receiving income support or the vast majority of people with rough sleeping experience. These figures come from Anglicare's 2020 National Rental Affordability Study that shows that there are no affordable rentals in Australia for a single person on job seeker and less than 0.7% for people or families on other forms of Centrelink benefits. In the 2 years since this survey, nationally rents are up 9.1% across capital cities, and they're up 10.8% in regional areas compared with June 2021. In Sydney, rents increased to a median of $500 a week, and in Canberra, where rents are the most expensive in the country, a median price property will set you back $690 a week. Both these figures are substantially higher than the payment a person on job seeker or even the disability support pension receives each week. As you can see, the housing options for someone receiving income support are so limited they might as well not exist. And that's where social housing and Housing First programs come in. Someone receiving a Centrelink benefit clearly needs assistance paying market rent. And this is where schemes like the Commonwealth Rent Assistance Scheme barely scratch the surface. But how does it work if Housing First programs are able to subsidise private rents? There are arguments against private rentals in housing first programs, including that money invested into the private market might be better utilised in building sorely needed housing stock. There's also the important point that echoes Leah's point earlier. What if there's just no rentals? There's an increase in both rents and competition for private rentals nationally, with record levels of occupancy rates. Social housing providers might also find it difficult being approved for properties in this market due to preconceived assumptions about the providers and their tenants. Putting that aside, private rentals work really well in housing first programs because they provide people with choice over the type, features, and location of their housing, which is something that even purpose-built social housing couldn't do. In fact, many housing first programs rely on this model of sourcing housing, and the first housing first program in New York did exactly this. It's also an important component of the program that I work for in New South Wales, Together Home. The Canadian organisation Homelessness Partnering Strategy have a great Housing First YouTube series and speak about even the act of sourcing a private rental as being aligned with Housing First principles, particularly choice and self-determination. A person has the opportunity to accept or reject a property based on their personal preferences, and that means that they can reject 1 or 2 or 20 properties if they feel that they don't meet their needs. In an environment where there's not enough social housing, and we know there isn't, despite moves in the right direction, and where private rentals can be hard to get, there's no clear answer on how to source accommodation for people. So in the absence of this clear answer, I'm going to hand back over to Leah to talk about how we can deliver housing first properties once we actually have them.
Thanks, Alice. So stepping away from where the houses come from, let's think about how they're delivered. Most of the work in Housing First focuses on how support is delivered differently. However, Housing First would be richer if housing providers also work differently. The decisions that landlords make and the approach that they take to both allocating and managing tenancies can have a significant impact on people's sense of home and the sustainability of their housing. In the West, we've been experimenting with a supportive landlord model, which complements Housing First because it enables housing providers to deliver housing in a way that is more aligned to the principles. The supportive landlord model has been used successfully in mental health for many years and has been adapted to the homelessness context to offer priority access to tenancies with additional resources to absorb higher levels of commercial risk and enable closer collaboration with support services. We've been running a pilot in Bunbury, and in this model, we're able to prioritise allocations to people sleeping rough and do best fit allocations in consultation with the local Housing First and other support providers, giving some of that choice that the Housing First principles advocate for. We trained our housing provider staff in Housing First and trauma-informed practice and gave them more time so that they had the capacity to participate in case conferencing and actively connect with support services to creatively resolve issues rather than lean towards more formal breach procedures. Also has some funding to absorb some of the costs to protect tenancies. Things like writing off rent, arrears, damages, and even, if needed, undertake some small property adaptations like soundproofing or fencing to improve tenancy outcomes. So while it's only in its first year, to date the pilot has seen no returns to homelessness. In fact, there have been no formal breaches of any tenancies. To run through an example of this, we've got 60-year-old Jerry, obviously not his real name, who's been sleeping rough for over 15 years. When a 2-bed over 55s property became available, we, as a housing provider, took it to the collaborative working group where the support providers discussed who was most in need and best suited to that particular property. Because of his age and health issues, Jerry was nominated. His alcohol and drug use and his array of mental health diagnoses did not impact the decision to offer him a home. Jerry is supported by the local Housing First service. So our tenancy staff work really close with them and have Jerry's consent to do so. The first issue with his tenancy arose when he was having lots of visitors and some issues with neighbours because of the noise and rowdy behaviour that was stemming from some pretty sort of hearty drinking sessions. Support services identified that Jerry was struggling to manage his visitors, was under pressure from them to have access to his home. They had his keys and were coming and going and intimidating both him and his neighbours. In a general tenancy, Jerry would likely be breached because under the tenancy agreement, he's responsible for his visitors' behaviour. However, our staff had an understanding of his position from both their working relationship with his support providers and their training and trauma-informed perspectives. Instead, we allowed time for support services to work with Jerry and his visitors, and we also absorbed the cost of lock changes to ensure that he was safe and secure in his home. 6 months later, Jerry has one person living with him, the friend who used to sleep rough with. And as it's a 2-bedroom property, Jerry and his support services are working with us to have Bob added as a household member. The trust we built with Jerry means that he wants to go through the right process to have Bob live there. Under his tenancy agreement, Jerry would remain responsible for Bob's behaviour and rent. However, we have the capacity and confidence of having that small supportive landlord subsidy to lean into this risk and support Jerry to have a friend, company, and be generous with his home by housing another person. And if there are issues, we'll have the capacity to write off a level of those debts, enabling us to share that risk with Jerry. If we look internationally, places where people have had some success include Finland, where there was a massive investment by government and a commitment to housing first as a mainstream response, not just a pilot program. In Finland, Housing First was led by a large community housing provider, Y Foundation. They converted shelters into long-term apartments. So in Helsinki, they shifted from 558 shelter beds in 2018 to just 52 in 2016. Y Foundation built or bought 3,500 new apartments and employed 300 new housing social workers. Effectively, they delivered a system-wide supportive landlord approach that both invested in housing and delivered housing from a housing-first, person-centred tenancy management approach. It's a good example of how we need housing providers to work differently to effectively deliver housing first. Back to Alice.
Thanks, Leah. So how do we actually go about keeping housing and support separate, particularly if supports are contracted by housing providers or supports provided in-house? The key is that supports and housing need to be functionally separate and have very specific roles that each carry out with the shared goal of ensuring ongoing housing and preventing a return to homelessness. This allows for unwavering advocacy to be provided by the support with a level of understanding on the part of the housing provider. Even if supports are contracted or in-house, this functional separation should be front of mind. There's also an argument for less entwined funding models for housing and support services, which we can see in the earlier example of the collective impact model. Another good example of this is Melbourne's journey to social inclusion, which has a 96% tenancy retention success rate, but works in collaboration with housing providers rather than contracted by them. A Housing First supports job is essentially to act as a go-between for housing providers and participants, if that's appropriate, while they aim to empower people to be their own advocate with their provider. A Housing First housing provider's job is to recognise the complexity faced by people with rough sleeping experience and commit to not just housing people, but also to reducing homelessness. Another important component of separating housing and support is how to keep continuity of support if a person moves home or if their tenancy fails, and the inverse of that, how to ensure stable housing if someone isn't engaging in support. So how do we ensure that participants in Housing First programs have access to their support even if their housing ends? Or maybe more pertinently, how do we fund this support? We've seen several Housing First-ish services who aren't able to continue support for people if their tenancy isn't successful. And that makes sense. They're not accessing the service anymore, so they therefore don't have access to the support. This can be an issue with programs like Common Ground, where support's tied to the accommodation. But I should note here that in a lot of cases, people are able to continue to access support after their tenancy. It's just not how it was designed. Someone leaving their housing and therefore their support can create issues with people re-engaging with any support or rapid rehousing, which is obviously pretty contrary to the goals of Housing First programs. This is where flexibility on the part of the support provider comes in. If you're no longer able to engage a person through your Housing First service, is there anywhere else in your organisation you can engage them? Maybe they're no longer housed, but would that then make them eligible for your assertive outreach service or your drop-in service? Are you able to provide consistency and continuity of support through any other avenues? In those moments, that's our priority. How do we ensure people have access to the services that can assist them to be rehoused as soon as possible? I work at a neighbourhood centre, so fortunately we have access to different services and people have the flexibility to move in between services. And we've seen this work well, both as a route into our program and a route to others if a tenancy isn't successful. One person we work with, we'll call Tom, was in his late 40s and had never sustained a tenancy for a variety of reasons. Through engagement with our front counter service, he was able to access our Housing First service. Unfortunately, again, for lots of reasons, that tenancy wasn't the right fit for Tom and he was exited from the program. But because he was already engaged with our front counter service and knew all the staff really well, we were able to mitigate that loss of engagement and look into other options with him. I was also lucky enough to go to the National Homelessness Conference last week, and the session run by peer workers with lived experience really stood out to me. One of the amazing workers mentioned that she feels like she chose to rough sleep for a long time due to what she called service fatigue, which is being asked to run on the same wheel over and over without getting any closer to long-term stable housing. And that's where continuity of support in whatever way we can provide it is so important. Now I'm handing back over to Leah, who's going to unpack what housing should look like if support isn't engaged.
So the flip side of Alice's point there is, do keep your housing if you lose or no longer want support. A very telling example of what happens if you don't follow that principle of separating housing support is a program like one we have in WA, which provides long-term housing and support to people with enduring mental health challenges. In a particular case here, a woman who'd been stable with her mental health and her housing for 5 years until there was some staff turnover issues with her support provider. As a result, the relationship broke down and she refused to engage with her support service. Because she didn't engage with a support service, she was exited from the program. Because she was exited from the program, she was exited from the house, aka her home. Within 6 months, she was one of the most frequent users of our local ED department because her mental health had completely and utterly deteriorated. Housing in and of itself is critical to maintaining people's wellness and well-being, so it needs to be maintained regardless of whether or not people engage with support. The supportive landlord model I mentioned earlier provides a useful safety net to help align this housing first principle of separating housing and support. No matter what happens over the years someone lives in their home, what support services come and go, one person will always go into their home and check on that person, and is in fact legally entitled and obligated to do so, the landlord. So a supportive landlord service adds in a safety net that means that if we respect the separation of housing and support, ensure people keep their home even when they no longer have or need support, the landlord can act as an early warning system. If the people's mental health or other issues re-emerge, it'll be visible in their tenancy, in how they keep their home, maintain their rent, and get on with their neighbours. These are things that year in, year out, tenancy staff are looking at. So if a supportive landlord can see the decline in someone's well-being, they could use their relationship to reconnect them to support services as needed. Working in a housing provider, we have some really long relationships with our tenants. In fact, we're thinking of doing 20 silver medals for some because they're celebrating 25 years in the same house. So landlords have a critical role to play in making sure that the principle of separating housing support means that people can keep their home and be connected to support as and when needed over the length of time. We'd just like to leave you with this final thought before we open up for questions. Homelessness is about a lot of different things to different people, but it is always about one thing. Homelessness is always about housing. Therefore, we really need to get the housing right, both the supply of housing, but also how it's delivered, making sure that it is aligned with those principles, that everyone has a right to a home and housing and support are separated. Now, if you bear with me, I am going to work out how to stop sharing the screen so that we can see if there's any questions. Trish.
Thanks so much, Alice and Leah. We did have a question that said, how do you manage client expectations around location or amenity and affordability when giving people choice?
Do you want to have a go, Alice?
I can have a go. In Sydney's inner west. I think the main thing is just being really clear about the limit and the scope of the program. As a support provider, we kind of talk through what people might be able to expect in a private rental, and then working through what their non-negotiables are, so what their needs are versus what their wants are, and then conveying that to the housing provider. And it's worked reasonably well. It's getting a bit trickier now that the rentals are getting harder to find.
Cool.
The second question was, if a client abandons a property and has debt and a poor rental history, how would you go about rehousing them or reoffering housing?
I think that's where some of that work of those collective impact projects like the Advance to Zero comes into place, where you're really engaging around other providers to make sure that we've got those commitments to rehouse people. It's very important, I think, as part of Housing First that we do that, because a failure in one tenancy doesn't automatically mean a failure in another. We had an example here where we had a family with a teenage daughter who had a tenancy go really badly, and the housing provider worked really closely with us and really stretched it out as long as possible, but eventually the tenancy did have to end. And that family, rather than going, oh, let's go back to rough sleeping, they went and secured a private rental. It was a few years ago, before the current crisis, and so we then just helped support them keep that house around their heads. I noticed in the chat, Neve was asking about, there's a recording. Yes, there is, and I'm sure Trish will be sending them out to all the participants.
Thanks for that, Leah. And the final question we had for today is, what do you do, which kind of leads on quite nicely, what do you do if a property manager or a landlord refuses to engage with you guys if the tenancy is at risk?
We were kind of talking about this before we started this webinar, and I think my experience has been that a property manager generally will come to the support provider as a first port of call if there's an issue, because there's a bit of a sense that we should be able to fix it for them. So that's not something I really encountered too much. And yeah, I would say that we are probably the first call that people make when there's issues.
I think as a housing provider, we tend to find the opposite. We're desperate to have support providers that we can talk to, because it just gives us another tool to try and work out that tenancy. And I think particularly as social landlords and as community housing providers, we're really committed to housing and sustaining housing for people. So, you know, any extra tools in the box, anyone else we can bring in to help us sort it out, you know, we'll reach out to that. Finally, there's something in the chat about the survey. Thanks for that, Nathan. We'll get Trish to have a look at that for us.
And I'll send out a new link to you following this session and the recordings from today and last week.
Cool. Finally, we'd just like to thank the community. Sorry, you can tell I don't have a slide up now and I'm trying to ad lib.
I've got it up.
Go for it, Alice. You can be smooth.
We would like to thank Homelessness Australia, the Council to Homeless Persons, and the Housing First Train the Trainer community of practice who have collated all the materials in this presentation. The next webinar will be in a fortnight, and it'll focus on the two principles of flexible support for as long as needed and active engagement without coercion. So I recommend you tune into those.
Thank you, everyone, and hopefully you'll get the recording out soon.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Bye.